The laughter echoed in the sterile, wood-paneled courtroom, sharp and dismissive. It was a sound Ethan Vance had grown accustomed to over the past decade, a sound that dripped with the casual cruelty of unearned confidence. His wife Clara sat beside her lawyer, her posture a study in theatrical boredom. She leaned over and whispered something, and the man, Marcus Davies, a slick attorney with a smile that never reached his eyes, chuckled along with her. They were a pair, confident in their victory, certain of the narrative they had crafted. The narrative of the long-suffering, vibrant wife held back by her dull, unambitious husband. A narrative that was about to shatter against a truth so profound it would rewrite their entire reality. Ethan sat perfectly still. He did not look at them. His gaze was fixed on the judge, a woman with tired eyes who had likely seen 1,000 versions of this same sad play. But she hadn't seen this one. No one had. Ethan held a simple, dark blue leather portfolio on his lap, his fingers resting calmly on its surface. Inside it lay the truth. Inside it lay the storm. Clara thought this was the end of their story, the final act where she would be liberated, financially and socially, from the man she considered her greatest mistake. She didn't know this wasn't an ending, it was a reckoning. And within the next 10 minutes, the laughter would die in her throat, replaced by a silence so complete it would be the loudest sound in the room. Before we watch that silence fall, I want to thank you for being here. If you enjoy stories about quiet strength and seeing arrogance meet its match, I hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's return to the moment just before the world changed for Clara Vance. Let's go back and understand how they arrived in that courtroom and why the contents of a simple blue portfolio held the power to unravel a dynasty. The story of their marriage, at least in Clara's telling, was a tragedy of mismatched potential. She was an Ashworth, a name that carried weight in the city's philanthropic and financial circles. Her father, Richard Ashworth, ran a successful, if somewhat traditional, investment firm that had been in the family for 3 generations. Their life was a seamless procession of charity galas, European holidays, and weekend getaways to their sprawling country estate. Into this world walked Ethan Vance, a quiet, thoughtful architecture student Clara met in her final year of university. He was different from the brash, entitled young men in her circle. He spoke about buildings as if they had souls, about the interplay of light and space with a passion that she, for a time, mistook for profound ambition. He was handsome in a subtle, understated way, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that felt like a safe harbor. Richard and Eleanor Ashworth were unimpressed. They saw a boy with no family name, no trust fund, no obvious path to the kind of wealth they considered a prerequisite for existence. "He's an architect, darling," Richard had said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth, during a family dinner just after their engagement. "He'll design a few nice houses for our friends, perhaps. A respectable, middle-class life. Is that truly what you want?" Clara, then still enamored with the romance of it all, had defended him. "He's brilliant, Daddy. He's going to be the next Frank Lloyd Wright. You'll see." But the years that followed didn't produce a modern icon. They produced a quiet, steady husband who seemed content with his small boutique firm. He took on projects that interested him: a community library, a low-income housing development, the restoration of a historic theater. They were critically praised, but not spectacularly lucrative. He would come home, his hands smudged with charcoal, his mind full of blueprints and structural challenges, and try to explain the beauty of a perfectly executed cantilever or the elegance of a sustainable design. Clara would listen, her eyes glazing over, her mind already on the guest list for her next dinner party. The disappointment curdled slowly. Her friends married bankers, tech entrepreneurs, and heirs to vast fortunes. Their lives were documented in glossy magazine spreads. Clara's life, by contrast, felt frustratingly normal. Ethan was a good man. He was kind. He was faithful. He remembered her favorite flowers and the way she liked her coffee. But he was not a provider of spectacle. He was a foundation, solid and unseen, and she craved a glittering facade. The first true crack appeared at Richard and Eleanor's 40th wedding anniversary party. It was a lavish affair held in a grand ballroom, a sea of tuxedos in designer gowns. Ethan, in his perfectly tailored but unremarkable suit, looked like a visitor from another, plainer world. Throughout the night, Richard held court, booming about market trends and his firm's latest acquisitions. At one point, a cousin of Clara's, a man named Julian, who had just made a fortune on a tech IPO, cornered Ethan by the champagne fountain. "So, Ethan," Julian began, his tone dripping with condescension, "Clara tells me you're still drawing your little houses. Find any big-shot clients yet? Anyone we might have heard of?" Ethan offered a small, polite smile. "I'm fortunate to work on projects I find meaningful." In his pocket, his fingers brushed against the worn edge of a small, leather-bound notebook he always carried, a habit from his university days. It was filled with sketches, calculations, and ideas. To anyone else, it was a simple tool of his trade. To him, it was a private universe. "Meaningful," Julian repeated, savoring the word as if it were a particularly pathetic joke. "That's what we call it when it doesn't pay the bills, right?" He clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "Don't worry, the Ashworth safety net is strong. Richard will make sure Clara never has to fly commercial." Clara, who had been watching from a few feet away, drifted over. She didn't defend her husband. Instead, she looped her arm through Julian's. "Oh, leave him be, Jules. We can't all be titans of industry. Someone has to design the cottages for the titans to weekend in." She laughed. Julian laughed. Ethan stood between them, his polite smile unwavering. But inside, something shifted. It was the quiet, almost imperceptible click of a lock falling into place. He saw with devastating clarity that to them, he wasn't a person. He was an accessory, and a disappointing one at that. He was a story Clara told herself, the romantic folly of her youth that she now had to endure. He looked at his wife, truly looked at her, and saw a stranger whose values were so alien to his own that he wondered how they had ever shared a life. The love he had held for her didn't vanish in a fiery explosion, but began a slow, quiet process of sublimation, turning from a solid into a gas, leaving a hollow space where it used to be. That night he went home not with anger, but with a profound and weary sense of resignation. The path forward was no longer about saving his marriage. It was about protecting his soul. The humiliation, once he started noticing it, was everywhere. It was in the way Richard would interrupt him mid-sentence at family dinners to ask a more important question of someone else. It was in the way Eleanor would buy him expensive clothes that were always slightly the wrong style, a subtle reinforcement that he didn't belong. It was in Clara's constant, casual references to her father's money as the source of their lifestyle, completely erasing his own contributions, modest as she believed them to be. He never fought back. He never raised his voice. He simply absorbed the slights with a preternatural calm that they mistook for weakness. They saw a man who was beaten down, who knew his place. They couldn't see the truth. He wasn't absorbing the insults, he was cataloging them. Each condescending remark, each dismissive gesture was a data point. He was an architect, after all. He understood that before you can build something new, you must have a perfect blueprint of the existing structure, including all its flaws and weaknesses. His own firm, Vance Designs, remained a small, three-person operation in a rented loft space downtown. It was his sanctuary. Clara rarely visited. When she did, she would look around at the drafting tables, the rolls of blueprints, and the architectural models with a look of faint pity. "It's very quaint, Ethan," she'd say, "very artisanal." What she never saw were the other files, the encrypted hard drives, the secure servers that routed through 3 different countries. She never saw the other half of his life, the one he conducted through hushed phone calls before dawn and late-night sessions on a powerful computer in his locked home study. She thought he was designing libraries. He was, but he was also designing an empire. The little projects her family mocked were just the visible tip of an iceberg. The community library he designed pro bono, he had also quietly bought the land it was built on a decade prior, and the city was now paying his holding company a handsome lease. The historic theater restoration, he had leveraged his expertise to become the sole consultant for a multi-billion-dollar fund dedicated to preserving historical landmarks across the country, a position that came with immense influence and a staggering consulting fee. He had started with a small inheritance from a grandparent, a nest egg no one in the Ashworth clan knew about, and with the same patient, meticulous strategy he applied to architecture, he had built a fortress of wealth so vast and so silent, it was effectively invisible. He named his primary holding company the North Star Conglomerate, a nod to the single point of light that remains fixed in a spinning sky. It was a private entity, obsessed with anonymity, and it had become a quiet legend in the upper echelons of global finance. A ghost that acquired, invested, and shaped markets without ever revealing the name or face of the person at its helm. One evening, about a year before the divorce, Richard Ashworth was pontificating at the dinner table, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. "The market is all about chasing ghosts these days," he grumbled, frustrated. "There's this outfit, North Star. No one knows who runs it. They just bought the entire block our main office is on. Outbid everyone by 30%, paid in cash. I've been trying to get a meeting with them for 6 months. My people can't even find a name. An entity like that, that's real power, not this nonsense of drawing pictures of buildings." He gestured dismissively in Ethan's direction, not even bothering to look at him. Ethan was carefully cutting a piece of roasted chicken, his expression placid. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and met his father-in-law's gaze across the table. "Perhaps they value their privacy," Ethan said, his voice even. Richard snorted. "They value power, and they have it, the kind of power that could swallow a firm like mine without even noticing." Clara sighed dramatically. "Daddy, please, don't talk about business. It's so boring, and you'll just depress Ethan, reminding him of what real success looks like." Ethan placed his fork and knife down, perfectly parallel on his plate. He looked at his wife, at the beautiful, empty facade she presented to the world. He felt nothing, not anger, not sadness, just a quiet finality. The foundation of their marriage was not just cracked, it was dust. And he knew, with the certainty of an engineer calculating a breaking strain, that it was only a matter of time before the whole structure came down. He had spent years building his silent empire, not for revenge, but for freedom. The freedom to one day walk away from this gilded cage and never look back. He just hadn't realized how soon that day would come. The catalyst, when it came, was as predictable as it was vulgar. Clara had started spending more and more time with a man named Sterling Croft, a real estate developer with a flashy smile, a dubious reputation, and a private jet. Ethan knew about it, of course. In a world of digital footprints, secrets were a luxury few could afford, and he had long ago learned to be thorough. He had seen the hotel receipts, the e-tickets for two, the late-night texts that were hastily deleted but never truly gone. He said nothing. He simply continued his work, his quiet life, watching and waiting. He was giving her the rope, waiting to see if she would weave it into a ladder or a noose. She chose the noose. One Tuesday evening, Ethan came home earlier than expected. A meeting had been canceled. He walked into their pristine, minimalist house, a house he had designed but that Clara had decorated to within an inch of its life, and heard laughter from the master bedroom. It was her laugh, intertwined with a man's deep baritone. He didn't storm in. He didn't shout. He turned around, walked quietly back to his car, and drove to his downtown office. He sat in the dark, looking out at the city lights, the grid of streets and buildings forming a complex, beautiful pattern below. He felt a strange sense of peace. The decision had been made for him. The ambiguity was over. He returned home at his usual time, just after 8. Clara was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, a picture of nonchalance. She didn't look up when he came in. "You're late," she said, her tone accusatory. "I had some things to finish up," he replied, setting his briefcase down. "Of course you did," she scoffed. "Your little projects. I was bored. I had a friend over." "I know," he said, his voice calm. "I was home earlier. I heard." She finally looked up, her eyes wide with a flicker of panic, quickly replaced by defiance. She stood up, crossing her arms. This was the confrontation she had been subconsciously craving. She had prepared for it, rehearsed her lines. She would not be the villain. She would be the victim. "Good," she said, her voice rising. "I'm glad you know. Maybe now you'll finally understand. I am suffocating, Ethan. Suffocating. I am married to a man with no ambition, no passion, no drive. You are a ghost in your own life. Sterling, he's alive. He wants things. He takes them. He doesn't just sit around drawing pictures and talking about meaningful work." She was pacing now, her movements sharp and angry. She was building her case, not for him, but for herself, for the audience of her friends and family who would soon hear this story. "I gave you 10 years, Ethan. 10 years of my life, waiting for you to become someone. And you never did. You were content to be nothing, to live off my family's generosity and hide in your dusty little office. Well, I'm done. I want a divorce." The words hung in the air. Ethan felt their weight, but they did not crush him. They liberated him. "Okay," he said. His simple, one-word response threw her off balance. She had expected a fight, pleading, anger. She had not expected serene acceptance. "Okay?" she repeated, incredulous. "That's all you have to say?" "You've made your wishes clear, Clara. There's nothing left to discuss." He turned to walk towards his study. "Oh, we have plenty to discuss," she called after him, her voice regaining its sharp edge. "We have this house to discuss. We have assets to discuss. My lawyer will be in touch. Don't think for a second you're walking away with half. You contributed nothing to this marriage. You will leave with what you came with, a box of pencils and a book of bad poetry." Ethan paused at the door to his study, his back to her. He didn't turn around. "I look forward to hearing from your lawyer," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing the sound he'd heard in his own heart a year earlier. The lock was now fully engaged. The demolition could begin. The days that followed were a masterclass in organized, strategic action. While Clara was busy narrating her tale of marital woe to her sympathetic circle, casting herself as the tragic heroine escaping a passionless prison, Ethan was activating a network she couldn't even imagine. The first call he made was not to a divorce attorney, but to a woman named Evelyn Sterling. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was the senior partner at a firm that specialized in complex international corporate law. She was a legend, a woman known for dismantling billion-dollar companies with surgical precision. They had met years ago when North Star had acquired a portfolio of commercial properties her firm was representing. She was one of the very few people on the planet who knew who was behind the enigmatic conglomerate. "Ethan," she said, her voice warm but all business. "I was wondering when you might call. I saw the Ashworth name on my calendar a few weeks ago. Richard Ashworth, trying to get a meeting with your people. I assume this is related." "Evelyn," Ethan said, sitting in his quiet study, the blue portfolio on the desk in front of him. "It's personal, a divorce." There was a brief pause on the line. "I see. That is not typically my area of practice." "I'm not looking for a typical divorce lawyer," Ethan explained. I'm looking for someone who understands the full scope of the situation. They believe I have nothing. They are going to try and crush me. I need someone who can ensure the truth is presented clearly. Another pause, longer this time. He could hear the gears turning in Evelyn's brilliant mind. This sounds interesting, she said, a hint of amusement in her tone. They have no idea who you are, do they? None at all, Ethan confirmed. Send me the preliminary details. I'll clear my schedule. This is a matter of asset protection, and on that front, you are one of my most important clients. We will handle it. The weight on Ethan's shoulders, a weight he hadn't even fully realized he was carrying, began to lift. He spent the next week compiling documents, not with anger, but with the dispassionate focus of an architect preparing a final presentation. He gathered bank statements, deeds, stock certificates, and corporate ownership papers. He created a detailed timeline of his marriage, cross-referencing major family events and conversations with his own financial and business milestones. He noted the date of the anniversary party where Julian had mocked him, and on the corresponding line, he listed the acquisition of a tech incubator that would, 2 years later, buy out Julian's company for a fraction of its peak value. He noted the dinner where Richard had lamented his inability to meet the head of North Star, and next to it, he placed the signed deed for the Ashworth Tower, with the North Star conglomerate listed as the new owner. He organized everything into a thick binder, section by section. It was a complete and total blueprint of his hidden life, and by extension, a complete and total rebuttal of the narrative Clara and her family had built around him. The final document was over 200 pages long. He slipped it into the simple, dark blue leather portfolio. It looked unassuming, like something a student would carry. It was, in reality, a weapon of immense power. Clara's lawyer, Marcus Davies, sent the first volley. It was a letter, dripping with legalese and condescension, outlining their initial settlement offer. It was, as Ethan had predicted, insulting. They offered him his car, a 5-year-old sedan, his personal effects, and a one-time payment of $50,000 as a gesture of goodwill for the years of service he provided to the family. In exchange, he would waive all claims to the marital home, their shared investments, which were, they claimed, entirely from the Ashworth Family Trust, and any form of ongoing spousal support. The letter strongly implied that if he were to refuse this generous offer, they would use the full force of the Ashworth legal machine to leave him with nothing but debt. Ethan forwarded the letter to Evelyn Sterling without comment. Her reply was succinct. Acknowledged. We will see them at mediation. The mediation session was held in a sterile conference room in a downtown office building. The air was thick with tension. On one side of the long, polished table sat Clara, Richard, and their lawyer, Marcus Davies. Clara looked radiant, dressed in a sharp, cream-colored suit, a vision of a woman on the verge of a triumphant new life. Richard was a bulldog in a pinstripe suit, his face set in a mask of grim satisfaction. Davies shuffled his papers, radiating smug confidence. On the other side sat Ethan, dressed in a simple, well-fitting gray suit, and Evelyn Sterling, a picture of understated elegance in a dark navy dress. She was older than Davies, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an aura of unshakable calm. Davies began. He spoke for 20 minutes, laying out Clara's case. He painted a picture of Ethan as a financial and emotional drain, a man who had been carried by the Ashworth family's wealth and status. He used phrases like disparity in contribution and failure to uphold his end of the marital partnership. Therefore, Davies concluded with a flourish, our offer of $50,000 is not just fair, it is exceedingly generous. It allows Mr. Vance to begin a new life without the burden of any shared marital debt, which, I must add, was accrued entirely for his benefit. Richard cleared his throat. Let's be plain, son, he said, leaning forward and addressing Ethan directly for the first time. You hit the lottery when my daughter agreed to marry you. For 10 years, you've lived a life you could never have dreamed of. This is your chance to walk away with your dignity and a little cash in your pocket. Take it. If you try to fight us on this, I promise you, we will bury you in legal fees. We will take you for everything. You will be ruined." Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Richard. His gaze was on the polished surface of the table, where his reflection was a faint, distorted blur. Evelyn Sterling let the threat hang in the air for a long moment, allowing its ugliness to fully permeate the room. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority that made Davies sit up a little straighter. "Mr. Davies, Mr. Ashworth, thank you for that presentation." She opened a slim folder in front of her. She hadn't even brought a briefcase. "We find your offer to be insufficient. In fact, we find it to be so far removed from the financial reality of the situation that we can only assume it was made in error." Davies chuckled. "Error? Miss Sterling, with all due respect, my client's finances are an open book. Mr. Vance's, on the other hand, well, I've seen his tax returns. I believe modest would be a generous description." "Indeed," Evelyn said smoothly. "Mr. Vance has always been very meticulous in his filings. However, his personal income is not the full picture, not even close." She slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a one-page summary. At the top, it listed the estimated value of the Ashworth family assets, as declared in their own financial statements. Below it was another figure. A much, much larger figure, labeled simply, "Vance Assets." Richard squinted at the paper, then laughed out loud, a short, barking sound. "What is this, a joke? Where did you get this number? Monopoly money?" Clara glanced at it and scoffed. "Is this what you've been doing in your study, Ethan? Writing fiction?" Evelyn Sterling's expression did not change. "That number is a conservative estimate of my client's net worth, fully documented and verified. We have, of course, brought the full documentation with us, should you care to inspect it." She patted the dark blue portfolio that sat on the table beside her. "It's quite comprehensive." Davies picked up the paper, a smirk playing on his lips. "Miss Sterling, you can't just invent a number and expect us to take it seriously. Where is this supposed wealth coming from? His little architecture firm? I've seen their books. They barely break even." "My client's business interests are more diversified than you imagine," Evelyn replied calmly. She leaned forward slightly. "Let me propose a counteroffer. Mr. Vance is prepared to let Clara keep her personal jewelry, her car, and the contents of her wardrobe. He will not seek any claim against the Ashworth Family Trust, as it is, and always has been, separate marital property. The marital home, which was purchased and is titled solely in my client's name, will be sold, with the proceeds going to him. He will also be retaining all of his own business assets naturally. As for spousal support," she paused, letting the silence stretch. "Given the vast disparity in your respective net worths, and given that Clara is leaving the marriage of her own volition for another man, we will not be seeking spousal support from her. We consider that our gesture of generosity." The room was silent. Clara and Richard stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. Davies looked utterly bewildered. You're joking," Clara finally stammered. "The house is in your name? That's impossible." Ethan spoke for the first time, his voice low and steady. He didn't look at Clara. He looked at the single sheet of paper in the middle of the table. "I bought it with the signing bonus from the Westfield Tower project. The money was wired directly from my personal account to the seller. Your father's firm handled the paperwork. You just never bothered to read it." Richard's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. "This is outrageous. This is a fabrication. We will see you in court. The judge will laugh you out of the room." Evelyn Sterling smiled, a thin, wintry smile. "A courtroom is a place for evidence, Mr. Ashworth, and we have an abundance of it." She closed her folder. "I believe we are done here. We will see you at the hearing." She and Ethan stood up in unison. As they walked to the door, Ethan paused and looked back at his wife. Her face was a mask of confusion and fury. For the first time, a tiny crack had appeared in her perfect, impenetrable confidence. A seed of doubt had been planted. It was not nearly enough to prepare her for the harvest that was to come. The morning of the court hearing arrived, gray and overcast, the sky a flat, metallic sheet. The mood outside seemed to have seeped into the courtroom itself. It was a formal, intimidating space, all dark wood and high ceilings, designed to make one feel small and insignificant. For Clara and her father, however, it was just another stage. They strode in, radiating an aura of ownership, as if the very laws of the land were an extension of their personal influence. Marcus Davies walked with them, a briefcase in one hand, his expression radiating the smug certainty of a man who believes he holds all the cards. Ethan and Evelyn Sterling were already seated. They had arrived 20 minutes early. Ethan sat composed and silent, his hands resting on the blue portfolio in his lap. Evelyn was reviewing a few notes in a slim file, her focus absolute. They exchanged no words. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Today was not about words. It was about the inexorable presentation of fact. The proceedings began with the dry drone of procedural matters. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Marion Hawes, looked over her spectacles at the assembled parties. "We are here to hear the petition for the dissolution of the marriage between Clara Vance and Ethan Vance. I have reviewed the initial filings. Mr. Davies, I assume you are ready to present your client's claims regarding the division of assets?" "We are, Your Honor," Davies said, rising to his feet. He gave a small, confident nod toward Clara. "The matter is, thankfully, quite straightforward." He launched into the same speech he had given at mediation, but this time embellished with legal jargon for the judge's benefit. He spoke of Clara's significant familial contributions that formed the backbone of their lifestyle. He minimized Ethan's career, describing his architectural firm as a hobby business and his income as negligible. He presented their financial disclosures with a flourish, a thin stack of papers detailing the Ashworth family trust, Clara's personal accounts, and a joint checking account that showed a modest balance. "As you can see, Your Honor," Davies said, gesturing to the documents, "the financial architecture of this marriage was supported almost exclusively by the Ashworth family. Mr. Vance was a beneficiary of this generosity, not a contributor to it. Therefore, our proposed settlement, which grants Mr. Vance his personal effects and a generous one-time payment, is more than equitable." Judge Hawes listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When Davies was finished, she turned her gaze to the other table. "Miss Sterling, your response?" Evelyn Sterling rose slowly. "Your Honor, we fundamentally disagree with Mr. Davies's characterization of the financial reality of this marriage. In fact, we find it to be a work of fiction so complete it borders on perjury." A gasp came from Clara. Davies's face tightened. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is being inflammatory." "Sustained," the judge said, her voice dry. "Stick to the facts, Miss Sterling." "Of course, Your Honor. The facts are what we are here to present." Evelyn walked to the clerk and handed over a thick, spiral-bound document. It was a copy of the contents of Ethan's blue portfolio. "This is my client's financial disclosure statement. I would like to submit it into evidence." The clerk accepted the heavy binder, placing it on the judge's bench with a solid thud that seemed to echo in the quiet room. The judge raised an eyebrow at its sheer volume. "It is comprehensive," Evelyn stated simply. She then turned and walked over to the opposing table, handing another identical copy to Marcus Davies. "I believe you'll want to review this." Davies took the binder, its weight clearly surprising him. He scoffed, looking at its thickness. "A bit of overkill, don't you think, Miss Sterling? Trying to win by burying us in paper?" Clara leaned over and laughed, the sharp, dismissive sound that had opened our story. "He's probably listed every pencil he owns," she whispered, loud enough for Ethan to hear. Ethan's expression remained unchanged. He was a statue of calm in a rising sea of tension. I assure you, Mr. Davies, every page is relevant, Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the whispers. But to expedite the proceedings, perhaps you could turn your attention to Section 3. It begins on page 8. Davies smirked, shaking his head at the theatrics. He opened the binder, flipping past the introduction and the table of contents. He found the tab for Section 3, labeled Primary Holdings. He turned to page 8. The page was simple, almost stark. It was a summary list, formatted with clean, precise lines of text. At the top was a heading, The North Star Conglomerate, Summary of Major Assets. Davies's eyes scanned the list. His smirk began to falter. He saw names of companies, commercial real estate portfolios, and tech investment funds that were the stuff of legend on Wall Street. These were entities known for their aggressive, silent takeovers and their astronomical value. His breath caught. His own firm, a prestigious and powerful entity in its own right, had been trying for the better part of a year to secure a meeting with the principals of Northstar on behalf of 3 of their biggest clients. They had been stonewalled at every turn, unable to even identify a single human being associated with the name. His eyes moved down the list of assets, a litany of unbelievable wealth. He saw the holding company that owned the downtown office block, where his own law firm was a tenant. He saw the parent company of the tech firm that had recently acquired a company belonging to one of Richard Ashworth's biggest rivals. It was a map of immense hidden power. And then his gaze fell to the bottom of the page. There, beneath the staggering list of assets, was a single, final line. Sole proprietor and chief executive officer, Ethan Vance. The binder slipped from Marcus Davies's fingers. It didn't fall to the floor. His hands, suddenly numb, simply let go, and it landed with a soft thud on the table in front of him. The color drained from his face. It was not a gradual change. It was as if a switch had been flipped, leaving behind a waxy, gray pallor. His jaw went slack. His eyes, wide with horror, darted from the name on the page to the quiet, unassuming man sitting across the aisle. Ethan Vance, the architect. The man he had just publicly described as a hobbyist with a negligible income. The man he had threatened and belittled on behalf of his clients. The man who, he now realized with a sickening, gut-wrenching certainty, was one of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals he had ever been in the same room with. The man who owned the very building his law firm paid rent to. He understood everything in that one horrifying instant. The quiet confidence, the serene calm in the face of insults, the hiring of a legal titan like Evelyn Sterling for a simple divorce. It wasn't an act of desperation. It was a strategic move by a king who had grown tired of being treated like a pawn. Clara, noticing his reaction, stopped laughing. "Marcus, what is it? What's on that page?" Davies couldn't speak. He was having trouble breathing. His professional life was flashing before his eyes. The humiliation, the sheer catastrophic foolishness of his actions. He had not just insulted a wealthy man. He had attacked, on the public record, a figure whose anonymity was legendary. A figure whose displeasure could blacklist him from every major firm in the country. He had committed professional suicide. He looked at Evelyn Sterling, who was watching him with a look of cool, clinical pity. He looked at Judge Hawes, who was now peering down at her own copy of the binder, her eyes wide. Finally, he looked at his client, Clara, and her father, Richard, who were staring at him in confusion. He slowly, shakily, pushed his chair back. He stood up on unsteady legs. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a hoarse, strangled whisper, I must request a brief recess." "On what grounds, Mr. Davies?" the judge asked, her gaze sharp. Davies swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He couldn't look at the Ashworths. He couldn't look at Ethan. He could only look at the judge, a plea for mercy in his eyes. "A conflict of interest has just become apparent, Your Honor. A significant and insurmountable conflict of interest." He took a deep, shuddering breath. Effective immediately, I must withdraw as counsel for Miss Vance. I can no longer represent her in this or any other matter. He didn't wait for the judge's response. He didn't wait for Clara's shocked cry of his name. He turned, grabbed his briefcase, and practically fled the courtroom, his footsteps echoing a frantic, panicked retreat. He didn't just quit, he ran. The silence that descended upon the courtroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of disbelief. Clara's mouth was open, but no sound came out. Her face, just moments before alight with derisive laughter, was now a frozen mask of shock. The color had drained from her cheeks, leaving her makeup standing out in stark, garish relief. Her eyes were fixed on the empty space where her lawyer had just been standing. Richard Ashworth was the first to break the spell. He surged to his feet, his face a mottled purple. "What in God's name was that?" he boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "What did you show him?" He pointed a trembling finger at Evelyn Sterling. Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head. "I showed him the truth, Mr. Ashworth, something you and your daughter have been conveniently ignoring for the past decade." Judge Hawes tapped her gavel, a sharp, authoritative sound. "Mr. Ashworth, sit down. Your counsel has withdrawn. Your daughter is now without representation." She looked at Clara, whose shock was slowly curdling into a dawning horror. "Ms. Vance, given this unprecedented development, do you wish to request a continuance to secure new counsel?" Clara couldn't form words. She just stared at Ethan, her eyes wide with 1,000 frantic questions. Ethan, her quiet, boring, unambitious husband, the man she had pitied and scorned, the man whose name was apparently at the bottom of a document that could make a seasoned lawyer abandon his client and flee a courtroom. The entire foundation of her world, the core belief in her own superiority and his insignificance, was crumbling beneath her. Richard, however, was not a man to be silenced by mere facts. His entire life was built on bluster and intimidation. He leaned over the table, his voice a low, menacing growl directed at Ethan. "What is this? Some kind of trick? A forgery? You think you can come in here with some fake papers and scare us?" Evelyn Sterling stepped forward smoothly, positioning herself between Richard and her client. "Mr. Ashworth, I would advise you to choose your next words very carefully. You are in a court of law, and you are making baseless accusations of fraud against my client. The documents are not fake. They are all verifiable through public records and financial institutions, should the court wish to do so. Your own lawyer recognized that, which is why he is, I believe, currently trying to hail a taxi." Her voice was like ice, calm, sharp, and utterly unforgiving. "Furthermore," she continued, turning her attention to the judge, "Mr. Ashworth's presence here is as a guest, not a party to the proceedings. If he cannot conduct himself with the decorum this court requires, I request that he be removed." "I'm not going anywhere," Richard roared. "That will be enough." Judge Hawes's voice cracked like a whip. "Mr. Ashworth, you will be silent, or I will have the bailiff escort you out. Am I clear?" Richard's mouth snapped shut. He sank back into his chair, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage. He looked at Ethan, a look of pure, venomous hatred mixed with a terrifying confusion. He was a predator who had just discovered that the sheep he had been toying with was, in fact, a dragon. The judge turned her attention back to Clara. Her tone softened slightly. "Miss Vance, I will ask you again, do you understand that you are without legal representation? I strongly advise you to seek a continuance." Clara finally found her voice, though it was a thin, reedy version of her usual confident tone. I don't understand," she whispered, her eyes still locked on Ethan. "Ethan, what is this?" Ethan met her gaze for the first time since the proceedings began. His expression was not triumphant. It was not angry. It was simply tired. He looked at the woman he had once loved, the woman who had become a stranger to him, and felt a profound sense of sorrow for the waste of it all. "It's the truth, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "It's the life I built while you were busy being disappointed in me." Evelyn Sterling took that as her cue. "Your Honor, while we are sympathetic to Miss Vance's current predicament, my client has flown in from Zurich for this hearing and wishes to resolve this matter today. If Miss Vance is unwilling to proceed, we are prepared to present our case for a default judgment based on the evidence submitted." She let that threat hang in the air. A default judgment would give Ethan everything he asked for, without contest. "Let me be clear about what that evidence shows," Evelyn continued, her voice resonating with authority. She began to speak, and as she did, she systematically dismantled every pillar of Clara's and Richard's world. It was the verbal equivalent of a controlled demolition. The marital home, a property valued at $8.7 million, was not purchased with Ashworth family money. It was purchased by Mr. Vance, in his name only, using funds from a bonus he received for designing the Westfield Tower in Shanghai, a project his wife believed was a small commercial building. "The deed, which we have submitted, is irrefutable." She paused. Richard made a choked sound. He had bragged about the Westfield Tower at a dozen cocktail parties, never knowing his own son-in-law was the lead architect. "The art collection in the home, valued at approximately $3.2 million, Evelyn went on, was not curated by Mrs. Ashworth using her allowance. It was acquired by Mr. Vance over a period of 7 years as an investment. Each piece is registered to a holding company owned by Northstar." She continued, her voice a relentless, dispassionate metronome of fact. She detailed the investments Clara thought were from her father, showing the wire transfers from Ethan's brokerage accounts. She brought up the charity galas Clara so loved, revealing that for the past 5 years, the largest anonymous donor at every single event had been Ethan himself, his contributions dwarfing the Ashworth family's public pledges. Then she delivered the list of grievances, not as emotional complaints, but as cold, hard evidence. "On the evening of your 40th anniversary party, Mr. Ashworth," she said, looking directly at Richard, "your nephew, Julian Croft, mocked my client's career. 2 months later, Northstar's venture capital division acquired a controlling interest in the primary competitor to Mr. Croft's tech company. That competitor launched a superior product 6 months later, effectively cratering Mr. Croft's company's valuation prior to its acquisition. A poor investment, as it turned out. At a dinner approximately 1 year ago," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "you, Mr. Ashworth, lamented your inability to get a meeting with the head of the Northstar conglomerate, the entity that had just purchased your office building. You were, in fact, speaking to him. He was sitting across the table from you, but you were too busy dismissing him to notice." The color drained from Richard's face. He remembered that night. He remembered his exact words. He felt a wave of nausea. Clara was pale, her hands trembling in her lap. Each revelation was a hammer blow, shattering a piece of her identity. Her wealth, her status, her social standing. She was realizing in real time that it had all been a mirage. Not only had she not been the provider, she had been the beneficiary of a man she held in contempt. The humiliation was so total, so absolute, it was breathtaking. "Finally," Evelyn Sterling said, her voice dropping slightly for the final, devastating blow. "Regarding the grounds for divorce, Ms. Vance has cited irreconcilable differences, stemming from her belief that my client lacked passion and ambition. However, we have evidence, receipts, travel itineraries, and sworn affidavits of Ms. Vance's extramarital affair with Mr. Sterling Croft, a real estate developer. An affair which, I might add, took place in properties and on trips paid for with funds originating from my client." She paused. Mr. Croft's primary financial backer for his last 3 projects, the very source of the wealth he used to impress Miss Vance, is a subsidiary of the Northstar conglomerate. Upon the initiation of these divorce proceedings, that funding was, of course, suspended indefinitely pending a full review. That was it. The final, perfect, poetic checkmate. Clara had left her poor husband for a rich man, only to discover her husband owned the rich man. Clara made a small, wounded sound, like an animal in pain. She bent over, putting her head in her hands, her carefully constructed world utterly and completely annihilated. Richard Ashworth sat frozen, looking like a man who had just been told the world was ending. He wasn't just facing the humiliation of his son-in-law's secret wealth. He was facing the terrifying reality that this man he had scorned now held his own company's fate in his hands. He was a tenant in his son-in-law's building. His business rivals were being funded by his son-in-law's empire. He was utterly, hopelessly outmaneuvered. Judge Hawes looked from the crumbling Ashworths to the composed figures of Ethan and Evelyn. She cleared her throat, her own composure slightly shaken. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "the court will grant a 1-hour recess. I suggest you use that time to fully absorb the contents of this document and consider your next steps. When we resume, you will need to inform the court how you wish to proceed." She banged the gavel, and the sound seemed to crack the very air in the room. The hour-long recess felt like an eternity in a second, all at once. Ethan and Evelyn retired to a private conference room down the hall, leaving the wreckage of the Ashworth family behind in the courtroom. Clara remained at the table, her head in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. Richard stood over her, his face a mask of apoplectic fury and sheer terror. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was a small, frightened man who had just seen a god and learned that he had spent years poking it with a stick. "How?" he finally hissed, his voice a ragged whisper. "How did we not know? All this time, living in our house, eating at our table, he was laughing at us." Clara looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. "He wasn't laughing, Daddy," she choked out, the devastating truth of it hitting her. "He wasn't laughing. He was just watching. He was watching us be awful." The realization was more painful than the loss of the money. It was the loss of the moral high ground, the shattering of the self-conception she had so carefully built. She wasn't the wronged party. She wasn't the victim. She was the villain of the story, a cruel, shallow woman who had been blind to the quality of the man she married, blinded by the glitter of a world that she now discovered he owned. Her sobs intensified. This wasn't just about a divorce anymore. This was about the complete and utter demolition of her identity. Who was she, if not an Ashworth of impeccable taste and social standing? Who was she, if the very lifestyle she used to define herself was a gift from the man she despised? Richard paced the front of the courtroom like a caged animal. His mind was racing, trying to find an angle, a way out. There was none. The evidence was absolute. The lawyer was gone. They were exposed, vulnerable, and at the mercy of a man they had systematically abused for a decade. Mercy was not a concept Richard Ashworth was familiar with, and he couldn't imagine Ethan would be either. He finally stopped pacing and looked at his daughter. The fury had drained away, replaced by a desperate pragmatism. "Stop crying," he ordered, his voice harsh. "Crying won't help. We have to think. We have to talk to him." The idea was abhorrent to him, to go to Ethan Vance, hat in hand, to plead. But what choice did they have? To fight would mean public ruin. The story would leak. The Ashworth name, his legacy, would become a laughingstock, a cautionary tale of arrogance and blindness. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The tension was still there, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a heavy, desperate humility. Clara had composed herself, but her face was pale and drawn. Richard sat beside her, looking 10 years older, his expensive suit now seeming like a costume on a broken man. Judge Hawes looked at Clara. Miss Vance, have you had a chance to consider your position? Clara stood up, her legs unsteady. She didn't look at the judge. She looked directly at Ethan. Your Honor, she began, her voice trembling. I would like to withdraw my petition. A murmur went through the small public gallery. I see, said the judge. And what of Mr. Vance's counter-petition? Clara's eyes pleaded with Ethan. Can we talk? Please, Ethan, just for a few minutes, privately. Evelyn Sterling leaned over and whispered something to Ethan. He listened, then gave a slight nod. My client is agreeable to a brief discussion, Your Honor, Evelyn announced. Perhaps in your chambers, to maintain privacy. Judge Hawes, clearly wanting this bizarre case to conclude as cleanly as possible, agreed. In the solemn, book-lined chambers of the judge, the final act of the Vance marriage played out. It wasn't a legal negotiation. It was a surrender. Ethan, I am so sorry, Clara began, the words tumbling out. I had no idea. I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I didn't see you. I never truly saw you. Richard, swallowing his pride, chimed in, his voice strained. Son, Ethan, what my daughter is trying to say is that we've made a terrible mistake. A series of them. There's no excuse for how we treated you. We were wrong, arrogant, blind, as Clara said. He wrung his hands, a gesture so out of character it was shocking. Let's stop this. We can fix this. You and Clara. Ethan held up a hand, a simple, quiet gesture that immediately silenced the powerful Richard Ashworth. There is no you and Clara, Ethan said, his voice calm but infused with an unshakable finality. That ended a long time ago. Today is just the paperwork. But it doesn't have to be, Clara cried, taking a step toward him. We can start over. Now that I know, now that I see, it can be different. I can be different. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time she saw not anger or coldness, but a deep, profound pity. Clara, what you see now is my wealth. You don't see me. You never have. You've fallen in love with my balance sheet, and if the numbers were to disappear tomorrow, so would this newfound appreciation for who I am. The problem was never the money, it was the character, mine and yours. The words were not cruel, but they were devastatingly true. It was the moral mirror reflecting her own superficiality back at her, so clearly she couldn't deny it. The divorce will proceed, Ethan stated. My petition stands. Richard's face fell. But the terms, Ethan, be reasonable. You can't just take everything. The house, Clara will have nothing. Evelyn Sterling spoke up. My client's terms were already presented. They are, in fact, exceedingly reasonable. He is making no claim on any Ashworth assets. He is not seeking to reclaim any of the money he spent on Miss Vance's lifestyle over the past decade. He is simply keeping what is his. She paused. Given the circumstances, particularly the infidelity, he would be well within his rights to claim significantly more. He is choosing not to. This was the final twist of the knife. He wasn't even going to punish them. He was simply excising them from his life, as cleanly and efficiently as possible. He wasn't acting out of revenge. He was acting out of principle. The lack of animosity was almost more insulting than any punishment would have been. It meant they didn't matter enough to him to even hate. As a final gesture, Ethan said, looking at Clara, I will not sell the house for 6 months. It will give you time to find a new place to live. I will also provide you with a one-time settlement, not the $50,000 you offered me, $1 million. It will be enough to start a new life, a real one. After that, you are on your own. $1 million. To the woman who had demanded half of a fortune she now knew was in the billions, it was nothing. It was an insult. But to the woman who legally was entitled to nothing, it was a life raft. And you, Richard, Ethan said, turning his cool gaze on his father-in-law, your firm's lease on the Ashworth Tower is up for renewal in 8 months. I will be raising the rent to market rate. I suggest you start preparing your budget accordingly. It was not a threat of eviction. It was not a declaration of war. It was a simple statement of business. The personal relationship was over. Now, only the professional one remained, and it would be conducted on his terms. The power dynamic, so skewed for so long, had been completely and irrevocably reversed. The divorce was finalized an hour later. Clara signed the papers in a daze, her signature a shaky scrawl. The judge stamped the documents, and it was over. 10 years of marriage, a decade of quiet humiliation and hidden strength, concluded not with a bang, but with the quiet scratch of a pen. 6 months later, the world had settled into its new shape. Ethan Vance stood on the balcony of a penthouse apartment overlooking the city, a space he was redesigning for himself. It was modern, warm, and filled with light, a stark contrast to the cold, museum-like house he had shared with Clara. His work was thriving. He was taking on more public-facing projects, lending his name and resources to philanthropic architectural endeavors, including a new state-of-the-art children's hospital. The veil of anonymity was slowly lifting, but on his own terms. He was no longer hiding his success, but he wasn't flaunting it either. He was simply living it, authentically and peacefully. He had found that the greatest luxury wealth afforded him was not power, but freedom, the freedom to be himself. Clara's life had changed more dramatically. The $1 million, which had seemed like an insult, had quickly proven to be a harsh lesson in reality. After years of living a life without budgets or financial constraints, she found the money dwindling with alarming speed. Her friends, the ones who had flocked to her side to hear her tales of woe, slowly drifted away. Her story was no longer glamorous. It was a cautionary tale. Without the Ashworth name propped up by Ethan's silent wealth, she was just another divorcee with expensive taste and limited funds. She had to sell her designer clothes, trade in her luxury car, and move into a small, respectable apartment that she could afford on her own. For the first time in her life, she got a job, working as an event planner for a catering company. It was humbling, difficult work. Some days she was filled with a bitter resentment, but on other days a strange thing happened. At the end of a long, exhausting day, having accomplished something tangible on her own, she would feel a flicker of something she had never known before, a faint, unfamiliar pride. Richard Ashworth paid his new rent. His firm, humbled and downsized, survived. He was a smaller man now, in a smaller office, his booming voice reduced to a more measured tone. He never spoke of Ethan, but the ghost of his son-in-law's power loomed over every business decision he made. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true power is quiet, and the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. The story of Ethan and Clara became a quiet legend in certain circles, a modern fable about wealth, arrogance, and the true meaning of worth. It served as a reminder that what we see on the surface is often a carefully constructed facade, and that a person's value can never be measured by the noise they make or the status they claim. True worth is built in silence, with patience and integrity. It is a foundation, solid and deep, and those who build their lives on the shaky ground of arrogance will inevitably watch them crumble. What do you think? Was Ethan's response fair? Was it justice? Or was it a cold, calculated revenge? We all face moments where we feel underestimated or disrespected, and it's fascinating to see how different people handle that pressure. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found this story satisfying, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of hidden strength and ultimate vindication. Until next time, remember to look past the surface, because the most powerful forces are often the ones you cannot see.